So in this module, we're going to look at what is Azure and what is cloud computing. To begin, let's look at kind of a general definition of what cloud computing is. And I kind of want to start with number 7 down here. You know, if you look on the internet, you start looking up cloud computing, eventually you're going to come across someone who's built a t-shirt that says, it's not a cloud, it's just someone else's computer. And in the grand scheme of things, that's true. Cloud computing is large companies that provide computing resources that you pay for typically on a consumption-based model. So if you think about, you know, a regular corporation, you know, you buy a bunch of servers, you set up a data center, you're paying for those servers whether they're busy or not. And if you think about how you capacity plan for a data center, you typically have to plan for the largest workload you're going to have. So if you're, you know, for example, I don't know, like an accounting company, you might have over the course of a year, you know, a pretty predictable workload, but then around tax time, your workload goes way up here. Well, if you're planning a data center and planning your own hardware, you've got to buy the hardware for this level. And that could be extremely expensive. What cloud computing allows you to do is operate at the level you need, and then when you need more computing power, scale up. So you can buy just what you need, just when you need it, use it, and then essentially return it again. It's renting capacity for a very, very short period of time. And in the world of cloud computing, we introduced the term of what's called elasticity, or things being elastic. And that means you can scale up and you can scale down incredibly fast. There are cloud applications in the world, for example, that scale up in seconds to support thousands of additional users, and then maybe 20 seconds later, scale down again. It all depends on how it's designed and how it's built. The other big benefit you get from cloud computing is someone else manages very complex infrastructure. So not only do you not have to buy the hardware, you don't need the people. You can rely on the expertise of the cloud provider to handle very complex, very expensive, very difficult to manage hardware, software, and services implementations. When you think of cloud computing, you have to think of agility. When we think of the design of applications that run in a cloud-focused world, typically they're what we call loosely coupled microservices. Now, it's a very kind of, you know, sort of complex sounding way of describing things, but what it basically means is applications are broken down into very small pieces. And those individual pieces can scale up, can scale down, and can be distributed automatically using policies and rules. Typically, it's very standard hardware. Most cloud providers, you know, the misconception is that they use very complex, very, you know, expensive hardware. The reality is the opposite. Most cloud providers use basic hardware, cheap, simple, easy to manage, easy to replace, and they have a lot of it. It's typically very focused on services. Rather than you paying for infrastructure, you pay for the service. So if you think about storage, you would buy some hard drives. Well, if you think about storage as a service, you pay for the storage of those files. You don't think about how they're backed up, what they're stored on, or who manages them. You simply pay for it as a service. And then for many cloud providers, they're going to introduce standardized way of performing configuration. In the case of Azure, this is through PowerShell and something called an ARM template that we're going to talk about in a little while. When we start talking about cloud, you'll always hear the term private, public, and hybrid. Well, what does that mean? A public cloud is a cloud that anybody can use. For example, anybody can use Amazon Web Services, anybody can use Azure, anybody can use Google Cloud. As long as you have essentially a credit card, you can leverage that. A private cloud is something that's owned and managed by an organization. Now, typically, only the most sophisticated IT organizations will have a true private cloud, because it requires, you know, quite a bit of investment both in people and in hardware and technology to assemble a cloud. You've also got to have a legitimate need for it. Are you a company that's going to scale up and scale down and provide computing services to other parts of your organization or other companies? And then finally, a hybrid cloud is a combination of the two. Now, the reality is most companies that leverage cloud technology leverage the hybrid cloud model. They have some notion of applications, data, infrastructure that they own and they manage in their own centers. And they also supplement that with public or private cloud. So going back to my accounting example from a few minutes ago, here we are. If I'm that accounting firm and I look at my workload and I go like this, I might buy the hardware to be able to operate at my average level throughout the course of the year. And I may run my accounting applications on that hardware, for 9 months or 10 months or 11 months of the year. But during that 1 or 2 months of accounting season, I may purchase public cloud capacity to supplement my hardware. Now, this is the reality that most companies are in. They have some infrastructure on site, they have some applications on site, and they'll leverage public cloud so they can scale up, allowing them to invest at a more realistic level in the hardware they need on their own locations. Now, when we think about what's in a cloud, well, what are the typical services that a cloud provide? And again, defining some of the acronyms that typically relate to cloud. The first one we're going to work with is called infrastructure as a service. We're going to start with the second one here on the list. Infrastructure as a service refers to providing you with the ability to run what is essentially virtual machines. So I'm going to give you a network where you can install things like Hyper-V virtual machines or other types of virtual machines, and you can run them and manage them, but you don't have to buy the underlying hardware. But you're responsible for things like updates, patches, configuration, security. We then have the notion of platform as a service. And platform as a service it's a little more abstracted. So maybe this is not a virtual machine where it's, you manage the operating system. Maybe platform as a service is I'm giving you access to databases and websites. So it's services that run within operating systems, so you don't have to worry about, for example, patching a SQL server. You just subscribe to a database. But then you have to build the application to write, to manage, to read data, to add things. You have to build the app that uses the database. Software as a service takes it to a more abstracted level. And this is when you begin to think about, I want to go online and I want to subscribe to a web-based accounting package or a web-based travel package, or in the case of Microsoft Office 365, web-based versions of Word, Excel, and PowerPoint. You're not worrying about the infrastructure it's running on. You're not worrying about the databases and the web servers. You're subscribing to the complete package based on how you use it. So if you've ever gone online and used a travel site like Expedia, that's to a degree software as a service. If you've ever used Salesforce.com, if you've ever used Office 365, if you've ever used QuickBooks Online, these are all examples of software as a service. And then finally, some companies offer what are called packages as a service. So this combines a combination of all three. For example, disaster recovery. There are companies that will offer disaster recovery as a service, where they'll manage your entire infrastructure, all your data, all your apps, and give you the ability to recover that immediately regardless of what it is. So you don't have to think about it. You simply subscribe to a service level for whatever combination of packages that you want. When we think about what options we have at a more granular level of detail, what are the compute options up in the cloud? Well, the first one is a virtual machine. Now this is, for most people who think about cloud, especially IT pros that think about cloud, virtual machines are the first thing that comes to mind. I don't want to deploy Hyper-V and storage and networking in my data center. I just want a place to run my virtual machines. I have a virtual machine, it has a piece of software, maybe it's Linux, maybe it's Windows. I just want a place to run it. Well, services like Azure give you a place to run your virtual machine, and they'll worry about the performance, the reliability, and the availability. We have the notion of what are called cloud services. Cloud services are collections of components that put together to deliver things like virtual machines. For example, public IP addresses, storage, and the virtual machine itself. We have remote app. If you've ever run a terminal server, I use the legacy term because I think that's an easy term to understand. If you've ever run a terminal server, you can actually run your terminal servers in Azure and deliver only the applications you need without you worrying about having to deploy terminal server. This is an example of the package service we talked about a few minutes ago. We have the service fabric, which allows you to distribute application data. And something that's fairly new is something called the Azure Container Service. So if you've ever worked with Docker or heard of Docker, you can deploy Docker-style containers running either Windows or Linux on Azure and leverage the benefits of containers for application deployment. And then finally, we have something called the app service. The app service allows you to deploy entire applications and distribute them for both PC and mobile implementations. You can automate the installation of the application, you can distribute the data, and you can use standard tools such as Visual Studio or other languages that you're familiar with to build these applications. So when we think about these different options on how we can actually go in and build different applications and different solutions for Azure, it's important to note that with each of these methods that we can choose, there's benefits, there's drawbacks, and there's differences. So this slide provides you kind of a good example of how you would think about that. Number one, Azure Virtual Machines. Azure Virtual Machines give you the most control and the most flexibility. However, you are responsible for all the management, so there's a great deal of work. So when we think about how easy it is, or the flexibility you get, low ease of management, low agility with virtual machines, because you have to manage the operating system. But if you can run it on an operating system such as Linux or Windows, you can run it in Azure. Cloud services give you a little more flexibility, but not all applications can run in cloud services. If you have an application that runs, for example, within IIS, you may have to make some modifications to run that, for example, in an Azure website. So this up here, IIS, would run just fine. An Azure website, down here, you may need to make some modifications to the application. And then finally, if you move it to a true cloud-focused app, you may have to make additional modifications, but you'll notice that the flexibility, the management gets much, much better. So it's balancing trade-offs. When you build an application, when you build a solution, you need to choose sort of the investment level. Do you want to simply replace your data center with cloud? You can leverage virtual machines. Do you want to take full advantage of cloud, completely restructure, rebuild, modify your application to leverage the advantage of cloud? Then you can use other capabilities such as app service for better management, better agility, and in the grand scheme of things, potentially lower cost. So that's a quick look at what we mean by cloud computing, what are some of the big benefits of cloud computing, and we'll start by looking at now in our next module, our next section, some of the more details of how Azure implements cloud computing.